For my final presentation of the summer semester, I thought I'd go a little bit out of my comfort zone and discuss the economics of the late Middle Ages, specifically as it relates to the Great Bullion Famine. If you guys remember from our reading on Ahmad al-Mansur, the Great Bullion Famine partly explains the Portuguese presence in Morocco during the 16th century. Without the Portuguese presence and their subsequent removal, Ahmad al-Mansur wouldn't have his first stash of available funds in the form of ransom money at the ready to finance his administrative and military reform. Basically, the Portuguese wanted to use the Moroccans to solve their bullion problems, and the Moroccans wanted to at the same time use the Portuguese to solve their own financial issues. I want to take a look at the origins of this 15th century Great Bullion Famine in Europe and the extent to which it might have affected early European excursions into trade in West Africa. To begin talking about the Great Bullion Famine of the 15th century, we have to first talk about the Black Death in the 14th. This plague was characterized by the appearance of abscesses known as buboes, as well as by the black coloration of the skin as the flesh died, a symptom from which the Black Death derives its name. The pandemic caused a major population decline in Europe. Some historians have argued that this population decline directly caused wealth to be concentrated in towns, resulting in turn in a high demand for quote-unquote luxury items. However, since the plague had largely decimated the part of the local population that produced these luxury goods, Europe began to export more money into the East than it imported, creating what is known as a balance of payments deficit. The money they exported was in the form of coins made of precious metals, in effect devastating Europe's reserves of bullion. European mints began to slow down, which can be seen as evidence supporting this theory. However, economist Nathan Sussman argues that just because minting was not documented does not mean that minting did not occur. He presents a new line of thinking that townspeople who inherited money from those deceased from the bubonic plague actually hoarded their newfound riches, complicating the old hypothesis. Sussman's new theory suggests that Europe could have either developed a precious metal shortage and increase in the balance of payments, or developed a balance of payments shortage and increase in the amount of precious metals. He argues that Europe probably experienced the latter in the 14th century, and that certain regions, particularly in France, actually increased minting levels. However, he concludes that the bullion famine that affected Europe in the 15th century was likely more severe, though he largely invalidates its first phase. An analysis by Oliver Colcart and Nicholas Wolff, referring to the financial integration in mid-14th century to early 15th century Europe, examines points of exchange rate between three Central European currencies from the Hanseatic League. They argue that equilibrium, or parity, is affected by the cost of information, insurance, and shipment that defines the silver points. This analysis is complementary to Sussman's because the merchants who are hoarding the funds were actually doing arbitrage to profit from the short-term lack of equilibrium. Overall, even in the Middle Ages, the markets were integrated, though the process of integration was affected by transactional costs, which included information costs and transportation costs. It makes sense for Southern Europeans, then, to try to integrate with North Africa because of short distances. The Wangara, a people from West Africa, had up until 1471 controlled the Akan gold trade. Akan is a region in what is today Ghana. As a result of this Wangaran monopoly, a lot of the gold bullion was transferred to West Sudanese markets. When the Portuguese began trade relations in Africa at the end of the 15th century, they entered a complex system of trade that was already well established. As a result of trading with the Wangara for so long, the Akan had developed consumer preferences that the Portuguese could not satisfy. There was one notable gap in the market, namely the selling of firearms. However, there was a papal mandate that was in 1481 that banned the selling of arms to outlets where they could end up in Muslim hands. When the Portuguese built the Fort São Jorge in the city of Elmina, they expected to profit by selling cloth, but the Akan were unimpressed by the Portuguese product. They bought any object made of copper and brass, but in order to make significant financial gains, the Portuguese became involved in the slave market, providing a commodity that was in such high demand it could, quote, be readily traded against gold, end quote. Slaves were so valuable because Akan entrepreneurs wanted a source of cheap labor to make more land available to till. Since the Portuguese were already in control of a number of maritime routes, they were in the perfect position to become very profitable in this trade. At the risk of imposing 21st century ethics on the 16th century, I would like to pause here to note that, essentially, the Portuguese were restricted from entering the firearms trade because it was deemed immoral, and as a result entered the slave trade. When in 1477 the Songhay expanded into areas where the Wangarans had established themselves, the Wangara were for the first time obliged to do business a bit more intimately with the Portuguese. Around 80 years later, the Malian ruler tried to take over portions of the Wangara gold trade, making it as far as occupying the Bijou. This gave him both access to the Wangaran center for distribution as well as Elmina where the Portuguese had their fort, but this expedition ultimately failed. We can see that beginning in the 15th century, the Portuguese shifted their center for trade from the Mediterranean, where, quote, West Africa had been a geographically peripheral but commercially central part, end quote, to the Atlantic. Overall, the Atlantic economy grew as a result of the Portuguese desire for gold and the African demand for slaves. This created monetary expansion in the European coinage, which resulted in the further economic advancement of the continent. In conclusion, we can see that European expansion into Africa was a process that actually began because of economic forces dating back to the 14th century. This sets the context for the economic climate in which Ahmad al-Mansur entered. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have an excellent rest of the summer.